Hello, I'm Janice Stevenson, the host of Bethel Today, the show sponsored by the Bethel Democratic Town Committee. And today I'm pleased to welcome one of our candidates for governor, and that is Dan Malloy, the former mayor of Stamford. Dan, welcome to our show.
Great to be with you. It's a great opportunity to talk to people in town.
That's great. I'm very pleased that we were able to get you to fit us into your schedule. I do just want to mention before we really get started that there have been a little bit of technical difficulties with the color. So if the color today seems a little strange, it may not be your set. It more likely is something that's happening with the system at the moment. But that aside, let's get going.
Sure.
So, very pleased to have you here. I'd like to start, I think, with a little bit about your background. You want to just give me a little background on who you are and how you got here?
Yeah, well, it's a good question, and it'll take a little time. So let me just start that I am the endorsed candidate of the Democratic Party. Won the convention by better than 2-to-1, as did my running mate Nancy Wyman, the state comptroller, who's now running for lieutenant governor. I suppose my story goes all the way back. I'm the youngest of 8 children. I was born in Stamford, Connecticut, to a middle-class family. My mother was a school nurse when I was growing up. My dad sold insurance. They raised the 8 of us. That agency and my mother's hard work paid for our education. When I was born, 55 years ago, just had my birthday.
Happy birthday.
Thank you very much. I was born with some severe difficulties, both physical and language processing disorders. I was spastic as an infant. I had very little hand-eye coordination for a long time. It took me years of therapy to overcome that, which I had pretty much done by the time I was in 8th grade. The learning disabilities, which falls into language and formulaic processing, dyslexia, and other disabilities, really hampered me in my academic success until late in high school. Went away to Boston College, was the first student admitted there on the basis of a learning disability. When I went away to school in 1973, I was still listening to all of my textbooks on recorded books for the blind.
Yeah, I wondered about that.
Yeah, no, and I did that through my freshman year and the first semester of my sophomore year. By that time, my skills had caught up. I stayed at Boston College as an undergraduate, graduated in the 4-year period of time, and second high honors, magna cum laude. Decided to stay there for law school, and graduated from law school. In my 3rd year of school, I accepted a position to be an assistant district attorney in New York City, meaning I'd have to take the New York bar exam. When I took that exam, as well as Connecticut and Massachusetts subsequently, I was the first person in each state to take the essay portion of the bar exams orally who wasn't blind. So I had also blazed that trail for other people with processing disorders. That in and of itself is not an important story, I suppose. It's a little bit of who I am. I think there are other important parts that kind of go around that. My mother, when she was told as late as the 4th grade that as that term was then used, that I was mentally retarded, she knew that that wasn't true, and she made a series of really important decisions. Encourage leadership, encourage language and developments, the development of language skills, particularly oral language, because that's what I was good at. She also wanted me to be compassionate. I tell this story and people shake their head, but when I was 9 and 10 years old, my mother would drive me to nursing homes, instruct me to get out of the car and go visit people to brighten their day. She wanted a son who was compassionate. I think in many ways I'm in public service because I'm hardwired to do that.
Yeah. Did she do that with any of your siblings, or was that you?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, by example, my parents were community leaders. But I don't think that in some senses, I don't think any of them were encouraged quite as much as I was. And I think it was my combination of deficits and strengths and ways to overcome it. But I love public service. You know, when I became a prosecutor in New York City, I stayed in the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office for 4 years. I tried 23 felony cases. I had convictions in 22 of those cases. Wow. The last 4 cases were homicides. In fact, when I left the DA's office, I was one of the senior trial attorneys in the Homicide Bureau. I went back to Stamford. My parents were still living at the time. My wife and I moved to Stamford, began practicing law privately. But I immediately went on the Board of Finance, where I served for 11 years, went on the Board of Ed, where I served for a year, and then served as the mayor of Stamford Stamford for 14 years.
So basically, to put that in Bethel context, basically you've done the big three as far as it would be for us.
You know, on a local level, I've done the big three, and I think that really does get into state policy questions.
Yes,
I mean,
it does.
you know, we're more reliant on property taxes, which is a big issue in Bethel.
Yes, it is.
To pay for education. We're more reliant on property taxes to pay for education than any other state in the nation. Right. My experience as a mayor, as a Board of Finance member, and as a Board of Education member, really prepares me to do battle with that system. We've got to do something that every other state in the nation is doing. It's not as if we get it right and everybody else gets it wrong.
So talk to me then a little bit about, specifically then with the property tax, and I know this, just a disclaimer, this isn't what I told him we were going to do. We're just kind of flowing a little bit, but still staying around the key stuff. As far as property tax, what do you see doing? What are your thoughts on how that situation could be changed for us here in Connecticut?
Well, first you look at what every other state does. They do one of the following things. They directly allocate a share of the income tax. We don't do that.
Right.
The sales tax, we don't do that. The hotel and motel overnight tax, we don't do that. The utility tax, we don't do that. And then some states share some other form of taxation.
Sure.
We don't do that. So we don't do those five things. And that really is a big part of the problem.
Sure.
But then there's some other things that have happened. During the last 16 years, beginning 16 years ago, we were funding education on par with the rest of the 50 states. So flow of state dollars to local government was on par, was on average. It's now 17% less. So if you want to know why the problem is even bigger today, it's the lack of state dollars flowing to local school systems, and then the need to make up that difference on a local level, and then you use one of the most regressive taxes available, and as Democrats, we're not particularly high on regressive taxes, but use one of the most regressive as the way to pay for your biggest single expense in state or local government.
Right.
So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And so I'm going to change it. It'll take a while. We have other gigantic problems in the state of Connecticut with respect to how we're running ourselves, and that's one of the reasons I'm running for governor. But we can't put this issue aside. We've got to make progress on it.
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of tying into that is that I know that over the past several years in Connecticut, that Connecticut's been typically losing jobs, but while you were the mayor of Stamford, you bucked that trend, that actually new jobs were created there.
We brought new jobs. I mean, you know, we've been up and down for the actual numbers. What we decided when I became mayor is that we weren't going to make it as an old industrial New England city. In fact, no cities are making it as an old industrial, and that's Manchester, New Hampshire, or Springfield, or Worcester, or Hartford, or New Haven, or Bridgeport, and some of the smallers. So we decided to go in a different direction, and that was we became very aggressive on attracting new companies to locate into Stamford, and we were successful. Over 20 new companies, I think, is the number that we can refer to. Two of those being extremely large, UBS and RBS, two big international banks. But many other smaller international banks have their operations in Stamford. It actually is a financial center that stands apart from even Wall Street. You know, we're one of the financial centers of the world now. The level of trades taking place there and numbers of people involved put us on par with maybe 25 other cities in the world when it comes to financial trading. We built that, but we also did other things. If Fuji Medical has major establishments in Stamford, and really their growth business, which has to do with electronic medical data gathering and storage of that material is taking place in Stamford. Many other companies have grown and flourished.
So it's broad spectrum. It's not just the financial industry.
Well, it absolutely is not. And then when you talk about the multiplier effect, what happens is they're supporting small businesses.
Oh, absolutely. Now,
we did lose Clairol, an old industrial company, and we lost Pitney Bowes Manufacturing, old industrial companies. But we knew that was going to happen, and it actually relates to one of the big problems in Connecticut, and that is that we pay this tremendous premium on electricity. And in manufacturing, I firmly believe that the 76% premium that we're paying, that is Connecticut residents, your fellow residents of Bethel, are paying 76% more for electricity than the national average.
Yeah, it's really incredible.
Well, I'll give you another statistic, though. In 2004, that premium was only 35%. So it went from 35% to 76%. You never heard the people talk about it or do enough in Hartford. But think of all of the manufacturing jobs this state lost while that premium got bigger and bigger and bigger.
And what are you looking to do about that? Because I know that just the whole energy situation in general is something you've also really put a lot of thought into.
I do, and I've been speaking about it for years. And how we implemented deregulation turned out to be a disaster for Connecticut for a number of reasons. One of those biggest reasons is we took our eye off the ball, and we didn't make sure that the levels of investment by our major utilities that should have been made into modernizing the distribution system were being made. And for a period of time, they were not. Now, listen, I think these companies are catching up, but they really put us in a hole with respect to the ability to bring new electricity into the state and distribute it in a fashion that people could rely on it. It's one of the reasons that we pay this tremendous premium. In many ways, our price for 365 days a year are based on our consumption of about 20 days. And our inability to get extra energy to the state and be confident of its distribution is what's driving that price. So we're going to have to do a number of things. Number one, as governor, I want to cut usage of electricity by 15%.
Okay.
Obviously, it saves you 15%.
Sure.
But secondly, we'll have a very positive impact on lowering the cost, because those 20 days you now have 15% more than you thought, and you're bidding for the bid up is less. We buy our electricity through an auction run by ISO New England. I think that auction, the way it's conducted, is causing Connecticut to subsidize the electric rates in other states in New England. And we're going to have to sit down with ISO New England and our other state partners and make sure that that's no longer going to happen. We're going to have to make long-term investments in energy. One of the mistakes, I think, of the current administration was their energy investments in companies were not made with the requirement of preferential treatment by those new generating sources. I wouldn't do those kinds of investments. We need to get preferential. If we're going to invest in additional power in Connecticut, we need to understand that we'll get that into the Connecticut grid at a preferential price over the ISO New England price.
And you're also looking at, I know, clean energy alternatives.
I'm big on clean energy, and I think there are, first of all, as mayor of the city of Stamford, we did thermal, we did solar, we did demonstration projects of wind. We made sure that we were buying a substantial portion of our energy as clean energy, and I want to do that as governor. I certainly want to meet the requirements that we've agreed to by 2020 and be getting clean energy. I also think that we have to look at how we classify clean energy, and I think we could use a broader classification that would actually be more encouraging to things like using fuel cell technology, something that our part of the state is a real leader in. In Wilton and Danbury areas, we have fuel cell technology company that is doing a great job. We need to classify that as clean energy as a way of building that up. If you're getting zero or very low emissions, it should be viewed as clean energy.
Now, speaking of emissions, that also kind of brings us into the whole transportation thing. And in the same way that you had the jobs coming in, you also were working with transportation issues. And I know that Stamford, because it is on the New Haven line for Metro North, that you do have fairly good kind of connectivity, but it's really to New York. And I know that there are issues, even for someone like me, to commute into Stamford, as we were talking about before we got going. It's kind of a painful commute from up here.
It is.
And part of that is that the roads really can't handle it. So can you talk a little bit about what your thoughts are on transit for the state?
Well, back to the future. Let me just be very clear, back to the future. If you get the old train schedules around Connecticut, if you collect them from 100 years ago, they were actually providing better service in most cases than they're providing now. You could go from Waterbury to Hartford, and I think there were there were 2 trains an hour. If I remember correctly from that schedule that I looked at. There was service on so many more lines than there currently. So we need to go back and rebuild those lines, discover those lines, encourage the movement of freight on those lines as well as commuter traffic. One of the things that my experience as mayor taught me in Stamford is if you make it easier for people to use the system, they will use it. So here are two things that we did. As mayor of the city of Stamford, I was part of an administration that lowered crime by 63%.
Okay.
But the crime around our train station dropped even more precipitously, making people feel safe in using that train station. And we started to see that. So much so that when I became mayor, properties in close proximity to the rail station traded at a discount. Now they trade at costs and rent.
Right, I did notice that Thomson Reuters is right next door.
Right there, as is RBS,
yes,
as
exactly.
is UBS.
That's right.
So we did that. We saw a 200% jump in commutation, and you mentioned New York. We have so many people commuting to Stamford from New York. It's amazing.
Yes, you do.
A 200% increase from the New York City to Stamford direction, and from the New Haven to Stamford direction. Remember, Stamford's a city where about 44,000 people come to work every day, and about 12,000 people leave. So we really are, we import much more labor than we export.
Right.
But the second part of what we did is we knew that the state was not going to change its bus schedules to accommodate that new traffic.
Right.
And so we encouraged employers, residences, condominium complexes, and groups of employers to provide their own bus service. And as I sit here today, there are 27 different shuttle services going back and forth to employment places. It makes the system work.
It sure does.
And as governor, I want to do a lot of things when it comes to mass transit, because it really is a much larger portion of the answer than this administration has given it credit for.
Right. And then I think the other piece that I think also is real important, that I know that you've been real involved in, is affordable housing. Something that I was aware of is that I guess North Carolina is currently seen as really a sort of a leader in that area. And what are you looking at in terms of making sure that there's a way for young people to have decent places to live, and also seniors as well?
Well, Stamford's seen as a leader because we did some interesting things. We set aside, we established an ordinance and zoning regulations that require that 10% of all new multifamily, so if you're going to build a condominium or an apartment complex or a large development of attached or semi-attached units, then 10% have to be set aside as affordable. And they need to be affordable to people earning between 20% and 80% of the median, but it has to average at 50%, which means you can get pretty good rent still, but it makes it affordable for young teachers, young policemen, and firemen, people work in hospitals, people work in hotels. So that's really our contribution as a model to the rest of the state of Connecticut, something we were very proud of. And what ended up happening is we also changed regulations so that densities could increase to accommodate that requirement, so that we weren't asking people to take those units out of what they would have had under then current zoning. We were actually giving them the units and simply requiring that they build them out for us. We also rebuilt all of our, not all, but much of our older affordable housing that was run by the Stamford Housing Authority. In fact, we had 2 Hope 6, which are federal programs for the rebuilding and replacement of that type of housing. We did those successfully. And we have 2 state projects, that the last of which is undergoing that form of renovation. And it's made all the world. It's one of the reasons, a world of difference, I should say. It's one of the reasons that we're able to lower crime. It's one of the reasons that we have more people available to work in our community and great companies.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. Now, we haven't done the education thing yet.
Oh, no, other than spending. We touched, I threw you off because we talked about property taxes.
Right,
I apologize.
Oh, that's okay. That's all right. I can handle that. Because the other piece of it, and again, I listen to NPR, what can I say? They talked about, stuff nationally. So yes, I know Stamford's done a lot of this stuff, including the education piece, which is the other thing that's going to keep people in this state, is making sure that we equalize the education situation. I mean, obviously in the suburbs we do very well, but we have some real issues in Bridgeport, in New Haven, and in Hartford.
In many of our large cities, and even our medium-sized cities, we're seeing non-graduation rates of 40 to 60% in a typical 4-year high school program, and that's simply unacceptable. And then when you combine that with the fact that Connecticut has one of the most rapidly aging workforces in America, and then you take that and realize we're not preparing the next workforce, it's a disaster waiting to happen. So it's something I want to work on as governor. But as mayor, 11 years ago, Stamford stuck its neck out, one of only 4 or 5 cities in the country that sought to guarantee every 4-year-old at least 1 year of pre-kindergarten learning experience. That was my initiative, and something I'm very proud of. When we opened that center, Bill Clinton's Secretary of Education came and cut the ribbon. That's how cutting edge it was. That center, the William Pitt Center, has room for 365 children. We opened up a second center this past year before I was done being mayor for another 220 students, and that has expansion possibilities for another 220 on top of that. Why we did it was that too many children were coming to school, and that was their first education experience. They didn't know their letters, their colors. They'd never responded to a teacher, hadn't gone through that kind of separation. And it's just wrong, because we have a standard in the United States, and it was based on work that was done by a federal educational panel 33 years ago. And it said that we should build a system that guaranteed that every child would arrive to kindergarten ready to learn. But in many of our urban areas, a third of our children are still arriving to school without that, meeting that standard. So I wanted to address that. Another initiative that I undertook about 8 years ago was the establishment of one of the very first, if not the first, council or commission on closing the education gap that does exist in urban areas along racial lines or home ownership lines or parenting style lines. And I did that actually after encouraging my Board of Education to do it 3 years in a row, and finally when they didn't do it, I just did it myself. And I got a lot of criticism. Why is the mayor doing this? Why is he getting involved in our business? But I thought it was important that we tackle that issue. And I'm very proud that Stanford's seen some of the largest closure of that gap as measured on CMT scores. So we're doing something right. And Nancy Wyman, my running mate, and I have laid out a very aggressive agenda. In fact, all of our agenda
Nancy was her first elected position was also
Board of Education, and she was chair of the Education Committee when she served in the legislature. So we've worked on we've both worked separately on this issue. But we've said universal pre-K needs to be one of our goals. Looking at how we fund education and changing that is one of them. Then you mentioned North Carolina, so I want to go back there for a minute. One of the scariest statistics I've heard during this election season in my own research, I looked it up. In North Carolina, in vocational education and community colleges, they're spending $81 per capita. So for every citizen living in the state, they're spending $81 into that fund. In Connecticut, it's $34. And North Carolina is a state that's been taking our job for a generation and a half.
That is exactly right.
And they're preparing the workforce, and we're not. So we need a governor who's going to redirect at least a portion of our efforts to make sure that we're addressing that issue. The other thing I would say on education, because it's not just about young kids, on the community college side, we're going to have to move at least 4 of our community colleges, of which there are 12, in the direction or the ability to grant 4-year degrees. We simply have to come to grips with the idea that many people can't afford traditionally sized and expensed out education, and we can't afford to fall further behind. It makes a great difference. The greater the number of 4-year degrees in a state, the greater the prosperity of the state. It's something that I want to address.
Interesting, and I would think that probably traditionally Connecticut's been on the high end of that, and that's...
We were actually, it's a great point. I know I'm a little wonkish, but about a half generation, 10 years ago, Connecticut was #1 with respect to college graduation rates, where we have, in a very short period of time, shrunk to 7th on that list. And we're projecting to fall very rapidly lower on that list. It's one of the reasons that I came up with the concept that at least some of our community colleges should be 4-year degree granting institutions. Understanding when I use 4-year, that degree might be garnered over 8 years, but they need to get a baccalaureate degree.
Right, yes. And the deal with the community colleges as well is because it can be so much more affordable.
Absolutely.
Especially in conjunction or in contrast, actually, to the private schools that talk about, oh, we're going to teach you to do blah, blah, blah. And you can get that same exposure at a community college, and it's a much more affordable situation.
We should be very proud of our community colleges. These are 12 institutions, several of them ranked nationally as best models, best performers on the community college level. Having said that, there's always work to be done, and I certainly want to be an ally of that system.
Good. Terrific.
Yeah.
All right. So we're coming up on the primary. That's going to be August 10th, right?
August 10th. It's Nancy and myself.
That's right.
There's a team running against us, and you know, my message is that we'd love for people to come out and vote for the Malloy-Wyman ticket. We believe that we have the experience. You know, I'm running against a guy who's self-funding, using his own millions.
And just, you were the first.
I was the first person. I was the first person in the history. No, in the history of the state of Connecticut to qualify under the Clean Elections Program for statewide office. We raised over $250,000 in $100 or less contributions. Something I was very proud.
Yeah,
and I think, you know, listen, I supported that program. My opponent, when that program was adopted 4 years ago, said he supported it. Now he says he doesn't, but he promises to support it if he becomes governor. I supported it 4 years ago, I support it today, and I will support it as governor, and will protect it against some of these unreasonable challenges in the federal court. We'll come up with the right language to make it work. By the way, you know, there are other differences between myself and my Democratic colleague.
Sure.
But I think the biggest difference is I have the experience. I'm ready. I'm not asking you to give me an opportunity to get on the job training. I'm ready for this.
Yep.
Yeah, and feel good about it.
I've done it before.
Yeah, well, listen, I ran a $500 million operation. That's what Stanford is, and I did it successfully.
But it was, I mean, it was a governmental.
Yeah, we had 16. It was it was a government. It was a municipal government.
Exactly. But it was a government.
I had 1,600 employees on the city side, and an equal number on the Board of Education side. My opponent has 8 employees in the state of well, actually, he's one of 8 employees in the state of Connecticut.
All right. We are coming to the end of our time, and I just want to remind everybody that we do have the Democratic primary coming up on August the 10th. In Bethel, the polls will be open from 6 a.m. until 8 p.m. In addition, you will be able to get absentee ballots in advance, and I do recommend please get out and vote in that primary, because if we don't make that choice, then it gets made for us, and we may not be happy with those results. When I said you can get the ballots in advance, those ballots can be gotten from our town clerk's office, and very frequently, although I don't know for certain, she is open the Saturday morning before the vote, so that if you know you're going to be out of town on Tuesday, you can vote on Saturday morning.
Could I add one thing?
You may.
If there are independent voters watching, they need to understand that they have the right to go from being independent voters or to Democrats.
And they can do that fast.
And they can do it actually up to the day before Election Day. So we should invite independent voters, unaffiliated voters, to join us in our Democratic Party. And obviously I'm asking them for their vote.
And now we have to go. Goodbye, and thank you, Dan.
Thank you.